All right, welcome to another episode of Resiliency Rounds with your co-hosts Jeremy and Anish. We are in the thick of Aristotle's Nicomachean Ethics, and before we get started, we just kind of want to talk about. We noticed that we're about 1,000 listeners or downloads away from hitting 10,000. When Anish and I started, it was a passion project, and it was a passion project. Anish and I were going through the books together, learning together. It convinced me really to start recording and to continuing on. So we've kind of shifted our perspective a little bit on, well, if we've got almost 10,000 downloads, people are listening, and maybe we should take it a little more seriously. We're going to try a little bit more structure in our conversations. Anish and I can sometimes go on for an hour and a half straight and get really deep into something, but we receive, some feedback that could help us actually, make this more applicable. If you're listening and you like this, we ask that you give us a rating, that you give us a review, that you subscribe, and that you share. And we really think if you're listening and you find it's of interest, you probably know someone else who would as well. The conversations I have had in the last couple of weeks is one of the reasons why we've started to shift is because we noticed that we started looking at the fact that people are listening, but also that the more and more conversations I have out in the world, the more people are actually really interested in philosophy. This is our intellectual heritage. And this is an opportunity to reach more people. The great books, the great conversations, the foundation that philosophy gives us to live our lives and to live in society are critical. And we believe that we're doing our part, our little small part, in just sharing our thoughts and processing this as we go. Anish, would you like to add anything to that?
Thank you, Jeremy, for leading us into that. You're right. There is a certain responsibility that we all share in participating in something that is beyond us. It was when we started Resiliency Rounds, it was just a passion project. It was a way for me to make sure I continue to read and continue to have conversations with my friends about conversations that I find personally very enriching. It was a selfish project. I did it for myself. And in all fairness, it should be beyond that. And I've been very encouraged by the fact that we've had folks listening in and providing feedback, but we want to do more, just like you said. And so part of our process of revamping this is to organize our episodes. And instead of just providing our opinions on what is being said in the pages, we have decided that we are going to, based on the feedback, we've decided that we are going to pose questions that should lead to reflection both for Jeremy and me, and then for you guys who are listening. And hopefully, based on those reflections, lead to a change in our actions that makes the world a better place. I think these concepts of justice, temperance, courage, wisdom, these concepts, we need to solidify them inside of our mind. We need to build a toolkit that allows us to evaluate every situation that we encounter and use the gravity of these virtues to be able to then act in those situations and be and willfully look for an end that is in direction of the common good. Each of us needs to do that. And in the past, like I used to be very skeptical about it, right? But that's fine. Like if each one of us creates the republic inside of us, creates the virtues inside of us, and behaves in a way that is toward the common good, the world will be a much better place for it. And I think that's an important part of society and of culture. We need to create that. It behooves us to do so. We have seen what it looks like if we stray from it. If we say that none of this matters, nobody cares, we've seen what it looks like, and we've seen what society can be. And this is not how it should be.
Right.
In that way, Jeremy, we're going to change the resiliency rounds is produced and curated and discussed with our audience. And we're really hoping that we get feedback. And look, if your feedback is 1 star, right? If your feedback is like, this is terrible, tell us why. Look, we are not podcasters, we're just regular Joes, but we've been doing this for a while, and we love it, and we want you to love it. And if we can make this any better, please give us feedback, and we will improve, and we will get better. Okay. So thank you again. Thank you everybody for listening. And thank you. My gosh, 10,000 downloads. I would have never thought that we would come that close to this. There's no way. I,
Very exciting, right? Yeah.
it's super exciting.
Kind of hit me like a slap across the face when you shared that with me. I was like, oh my gosh, maybe we should take this seriously a little bit, right? And I'll just say one more thing and then we can jump in, which is, I think it was last episode or 2 episodes, I even questioned myself in terms of what am I doing reading this, right? And you called me out on it. You actually waited till the end of the episode, but I think you were triggered by it. You're like, no. This is for everyone, and you're asking deep questions, and you're trying to understand it. And I think that it's important to kind of it was important for my own reframe. It's important for others who are listening to this, because some of the feedback is like, wow, this is hard, this is deep. It's not easy to read. And that's the point. And part of what we're trying to do is make it more accessible to everyone, because we can all benefit from this. So with that, we'll start with a real light question, right? We're in book 5 of Nicomachean Ethics, and we're starting on chapter 2. We discussed in great detail chapter 1 last episode. We're going to go through a few chapters today with a different type of frame. And the first question we're starting with is, and this is the overall question that we'd like you to think about, and we'll come back to it at the end, which is, are you just following the law, or do we have to hold ourselves to a higher standard? So as we're going through our lives, are we just following the laws that exist, or should we be holding ourselves to a higher standard?
Yeah, I think that sums up these few chapters now. What Aristotle is saying is that when it comes to the virtue of justice, there are 2 aspects to it. One is justice as it pertains to the morally excellent or the virtuous individual. In other words, what is justice like for Socrates? And then there is a justice in the more common sense of the term. That is, what does it mean to be fair in the dealings with our neighbors? And when it comes to day-to-day things, like it's the particulars and not this general sense of justice in this big sphere of what it is to live a good life. And so he creates that demarcation early on. He says there are 2 types. What Aristotle wants to focus on is the justice as a virtue for a morally excellent person. But Aristotle being Aristotle, he is delivering these lecture series to kings, to princes, to future heads of state. And he wants them to go ahead and create the perfect republic. And so he is also providing a very logical way to think of particular justice. Justice as it pertains to a constitution, justice as it pertains to civil law, to criminal law. And so he kind of goes into that a little bit. So when I look at this, just reading it for myself, in my personal opinion, I came to this more from the justice as a virtue concept, and less from justice as law from a criminal civil perspective as well. But what I found is that there's a subset and a superset. And it is strange that Aristotle views it very differently than I view it. And maybe that's because I'm a little bit more cynical about the way the world is, and I want to see what your thoughts are on this, Jeremy. But what Aristotle says is that the laws, if they are created in a virtuous state, in a philosophical republic, by a philosopher king, that means a republic that is governed by wisdom, then the laws of that republic are going to be based on virtue. They're going to be this overarching Socratic virtue, justice. And inside of that, there is going to be the fairness element. Like, how do you distribute grain? How do you decide disputes in land? And how do you then deal with criminal behavior, things like that? Now, so in Aristotelian terms, another way to look at this is that if one is following the laws of a philosophical republic, by following those laws, one is meeting the requirements of being a virtuous individual. But when I look at the constitutions and I look at the laws, I can tell you that I don't know of a single, philosophical republic, a republic based on wisdom. I think the founding fathers tried to create one. And I think, even if you look at what happened in Great Britain and constitutions around, I think there's an attempt to do so. But it's hard to do in a democracy, which is I still believe it's the best form of government. But the laws that are created are not based on being a morally excellent or a virtuous individual. So then what ends up happening is that the laws, in my mind, are a subset to a superset of what it is to be a virtuous individual. What is it to be a Socratic individual? What is it to be a philosopher king in one's mind? And that it becomes the superset, and the laws then become a subset. In my mind, I feel that following the laws is the least thing that you can do if you want to be a decent individual. It's not a high bar to meet, it's a low bar to meet. What do you think, Jeremy?
Yeah, well, I tend to wildly agree with you, right? I don't think that it exists. I think that Aristotle, in his attempt to teach others in working with kings and leaders and in wanting to look at it as, having more of a societal impact and not just about the individual, right? It's about how you all live together in, in, in a philosophical, morally just world, but that doesn't exist. I mean, as you were saying that, I'm like, okay, well, that sounds like a great utopian society, and it's kind of like a book that's probably been written, or hasn't been written yet. I think that, to your point, I think foundationally, a lot of constitutions, laws have been created with the foundation of these philosophical beliefs have always been there. It's a lot of politicians have studied that, but then we're so far from that now, where laws are being laws are being made. There's questions of we're making laws around what might be morally right or wrong based on viewpoints that that everyone share, but it's not about governing anymore. And so these laws, actually, we look back into the previous books with Machiavellian ethics, there's these concepts around, the other virtues come into play, right? And so, like, at the end of the day, being morally virtuous goes much deeper than constitutional laws, the laws
Yeah.
which we need to follow. And so, I tend to agree with what you were saying. Yeah.
One of the things that you mentioned is very interesting. So in the Republic, so the Republic is about this morally or virtuously developed constitution, right? And one of the criticisms that Socrates receives while he's delivering this to his interlocutors is that, okay, you have described this philosophical constitution, this philosophical republic, but this doesn't exist anywhere. Can you give me an example of this? And so Socrates, that is where Plato talks about the forms. Plato has this theory of forms. And one of the forms is like there is a prototypical tree that has all the qualities, the treeness of that tree comes from that prototypical tree. It doesn't exist anywhere in nature, the perfect tree. But from that, you see trees everywhere. And when you look at a tree, you say, yeah, it looks like a tree because it has the treeness, and the treeness in your mind is of that perfect tree. So philosophical republic is kind of like that. The fact that you can tell what a republic should be based on that perfect republic doesn't make that perfect republic a figment of your imagination. It exists. Just like the perfect tree exists. That's why you can find trees in nature because of that perfect tree. That's the example that he gives of that. So you can look at this argument both ways, that yes, the perfect tree exists, but really, does it exist? The perfect republic exists, but does it really exist? And the another way to look at it is also that, couldn't a perfect tree exist? Yes, it could exist. Similarly, there's no reason why a perfect republic cannot exist. Now, Socrates says perfect republic, where you get billions of people to be philosophical, is impossible to do. But he is using that as an analogy to say that one can build a perfect republic inside oneself. A rational individual can do that. And so that is the attempt there. But Aristotle differs from that. He believes that a perfect republic can be created by a philosopher king who would then impose his will onto his subjects. In the Republic, kind of talks about how a philosopher king would be able to do that through intermediaries and so on and so forth, and all of that. So, all that to say that there is a possibility to create a perfect constitution. And I believe the founding fathers here, and then whoever started constitutions elsewhere, tried to do that. I think there's an attempt. And what we see as failures are not, in fact, failures, they are challenges, but it can be adapted, it can be modified, and it can be interpreted. And the interpretation should be more refined as time goes on. As a society, as a culture, we should be morally, virtuously more advanced today than we were back in the day. And in order for that to happen, one has to understand the concepts that our forefathers understood. Like, they read the same books, like the Great Conversation. These great books was what they read. This was their foundational education. And based on that, they made decisions. And we are living in a world right now where we do not learn these things. And because of that, we are interpreting what they wrote in bizarre ways that is taking us away from society, from an eye toward the common good to profit. It's changing. There's inequality, there's injustice in the interpretation of the Constitution. Just to underscore your point, so the subset and superset here has flipped because of us, because we are not participating in the great conversation in order to improve on what our forefathers left us.
I think that it's actually a larger societal challenge that you're raising, which is that these books are meant to be studied and learned and interpreted and debated, and then the educational system is flawed in that we're moving further and further away from this. And as you start to read, I think the book one of the 52 books in the Great Conversation, there's an editorial around education, and specifically saying, right, and that editorial might be 70 years old. I think it was in the 1950s that was written. It was saying then we've moved away from this. College education, a liberal arts education, these books should be included in that. And so unless you're a philosophy major, you're not reading them. And even if you are a philosophy major, and I can't speak to it directly, but my guess is you're not going through all 52 books in 4 years, if that's even possible. I mean, some of these books like Shakespeare is still taught, right? I mean, but if you're into English lit, maybe you're reading Kant or Dante, right? But
yeah, but reading alone is like drinking alone.
yeah.
I mean, I think there is a debate that needs to happen, and there is a certain amount of practical wisdom one needs to have to understand what those words mean. Like, yeah, I could read Kant to pass an exam.
Yeah.
It's very different from understanding what does it mean what does the categorical imperative actually mean, and so on and so forth. Now, again, I'm not talking about armchair philosophers here, right? I don't think our founding fathers were armchair philosophers. These guys were riding horses and in waging wars, and they were living, breathing the times, right? We are nowhere as morally worthy as they were. Like, they were men of action, and but they had the philosophical foundation. We neither are we men of action. We like to believe we are, and we don't have the philosophical foundation. You see, that's what resiliency rounds is about, right? It's about the foundations of your moral obligation. If you are going to go out there in the world and you're going to move things around and intervene, you better understand what the underpinnings of that are. Like, who are you? What is driving your decisions, right? Jeremy, one of the questions that comes up, which Aristotle poses in this is, how then do you educate a good citizen? And how is that different from educating a good individual? You see the difference?
Yeah.
Because he says this, that perhaps it is not the same to be a good man and a good citizen of any state taken at random. There's a difference in being a good man and a good citizen of any state taken at random. Right?
One who's following the laws versus one who is living virtuously.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. Look, Nelson Mandela was not a good citizen of apartheid South Africa, but he was a great man.
Right.
Mahatma Gandhi was not a good citizen of colonial British times, but he was a great man. My point is that there is a difference in the education of these two people. Our education system today is about how do you be a good citizen by following the laws, pay your taxes, and all of that stuff. Right? But how do you become a morally excellent person who's going to stand up against injustice, do the right thing, participate in the common good? Right? Because it's not against the law to not be generous with your time, to not volunteer your time, to it's not against the law to not be charitable.
Yeah, there's a few concepts there, right? One is being a good person in an unjust society, right? Where the Constitution and laws, there are laws in place that might be protecting and keep the laws aren't necessarily just.
That's right. The laws are for the powerful. They serve the ideas, or they serve the interests of the few. In an oligarchy, it is the wealthy. In a democracy, it should be the people, but that's not what ends up happening. What ends up happening in a democracy, it is people who have status. Like literally, you can have actors become politicians just based on the fact that they're popular. So those laws that are, look, you create a constitution, and then you have lawyers out the wazoo, and they can then interpret those laws, and who are the lawyers working for? They're not working for the people. I mean, the wealthy can afford the legal system, to modify the legal system, right? The people with status, the people with power, the people with money. So it's no longer serving the common good.
No.
So then in that situation, the virtuous, the Socrates, the Nelson Mandela, the Mahatma Gandhi, the Martin Luther King of the world are no longer following the law because the law is unjust. So then how do you educate someone to be a good individual, a good human being? You see, I think that's where these conversations come in.
It's teaching so much more than memorizing the laws and understanding like what we're told is good and bad, or I go to jail, I don't go to jail. It's very, the laws, way we live is black and white. That not going into, to your point, they might not be morally just. So how do you create a morally just person? How do you educate them of that? I think it's to, yeah.
I don't know how you'd answer it. Like I don't have an answer. So the Republic talks about it. The Republic talks about the education of the virtuous human being. How do you create the philosopher king?
Mhm.
And all of that is just how does one educate oneself? It's a completely introspective act. Like on our logo, the mirror there is introspection. You got to look at oneself, and all of what's in the Republic is an introspective act. And from the kind of, he speaks about the kind of music you would listen to, the kind of books that you would read. I mean, this is the same kind of stuff that we are exposed to today. What kind of humor you should participate in. But the big takeaway for me from the Republic was one has to act in the world and act voluntarily. That means one is not being just led astray by convention, by appetites. What I mean by appetite is like, emotional or lizard brain kind of thinking. One is rationally thinking before they act. And one is not wise when one starts off in that course. But one says, I'm going to A B test this. I'm going to try this and see what happens. And I'm going to learn from it. And so it is thought, action, and reflection. Thought, action, and reflection. But you could do thought, action, and reflection without having any sort of underpinning, not having any sort of an understanding of where you should start first. We follow convention. The easiest thing to do is do what the world is telling you to do.
Yeah. Scenarios is a great way to reflect on
Dilemmas.
things, right? Dilemmas, right?
Yeah.
The poor husband, wife, the wife is sick and dying, and you can't afford the medicine, but you know where the medicine is. You can go and steal the medicine and therefore then save your wife. I mean, this is a type of question where you're starting to talk about, well, what is right and wrong in this type of scenario, right? Or, you put food on the table versus buying the medicine. So
those are dilemmas. But I'll tell you, a lot of people look at those dilemmas, and there's a reason why one cannot really argue their point. There's the whole trolley experiment and all of this, right? Once one can state an opinion, and you could change your opinion tomorrow because one doesn't have the philosophical underpinning. One is not seen as much in life to be able to actually give an answer.
yeah,
And the dilemma is that there's no right answer really. But what I mean to say is that there is in fact a virtuous answer there, but at least you have given it thought. You could say, okay, fine, I don't know the answer, but this is what Socrates would have done. And so,
right.
you know what? All things considered, if I'm not smart enough, I'm going to follow somebody who is, right? And there are three types of people. Like Aristotle starts Nicomachean Ethics saying this. There are three types of people: those who know that they don't know and are willing to learn from those who know. The third group is they don't know that they don't know, and they're unwilling to learn. I mean, I spent most of my life really in that third group.
You're willing to learn.
I didn't even know that I didn't know. I thought I was a cardiologist and all of that stuff. So, I'm sure I know. I mean, the world tells me I know. People come to me from all over the place saying, help me, but I don't know. I didn't know what happiness was. I don't know what justice was. I didn't understand the difference between the law and the justice in the law and the justice in virtue. And honestly, I didn't come upon these facts on my own. I heard Plato. And then, I read Plato and I'm reading Aristotle. That's how I know. I'm learning. I'm in the second group. Thankfully, I'm in that second group. I think that's a great group to be in. I think the first group is not for mere mortals. You brought up a very good point, Jeremy, which I wanted to say. The second question here is exactly what you brought up. And I think that's an important question. The first question that we pose is, what is there a difference between just following the laws and actually being a virtually excellent person? And what's that? And then the second one here is there a difference in injustice or the unjust person? The unjust person who does a wicked act for profit versus an unjust person who basically breaks the law out of an act of passion. What is worse? Right? The way Aristotle lays this down is he says that there are two types of justice. One is this morally excellent person. What does justice mean to Socrates? Right? In the overarching scheme of everything. And then there is justice as it deals with the particulars. The particulars as to how if you are a citizen in a constitution, between two citizens, how are the good things in the constitution distributed? Food, education, security, housing, how is that distributed amongst citizens in a constitution? Then, in interactions between two individuals, there are those interactions that are voluntary interactions where I get into a business with you. And then how then should the profits of that business or the losses of that business be distributed amongst you and me? And then there are others that are involuntary. Involuntary means that you and me didn't have any sort of an agreement to participate, but I decided to rob or cheat you, right? You are an unwilling participant in that. So that is a non-violent, involuntary injustice that I've done. or you decided to beat me up or murder me, and that's without me obviously agreeing to it, which is an involuntary, unjust act that is violent. So again, to just take along, there's a virtue of justice, and then that's one side. Then on the transactional side, there's a constitutional justice, and then there's a civil justice and a criminal justice. Now, and one way to look at this thing is we're going to set aside to answer your question, right, regarding this person whose wife is sick and is going out to deciding whether they should steal a medicine to save her life or let her die because they don't want to steal, right? For that, we are going to take away this morally or this virtuous justice piece. We're not asking what would Socrates do in that situation. We are looking at it from a constitutional perspective, from a civil perspective, from a criminal perspective. Okay. So I'm going to give you my opinion. I want to see what your thoughts are on it, right? Now, from a constitutional perspective, right? If this person is a citizen of a country and his wife is sick, she is a citizen of that country and she is sick, right? Is it just that there is a person who is a citizen of a constitution, does not have access to healthcare, and has to then rely on taking things into their own hands in order to provide life-saving medication with somebody? That's constitutional justice. Someone would say, what if this person was not a taxpayer? And there's another person who's paid their taxes, paid their dues, has government-sponsored, healthcare, is Medicare for themselves. And so then this person, someone could say, then this person doesn't deserve healthcare because they didn't contribute to society. And another way to look at this is someone is saying that one is more meritorious compared to the other. The person who actually participated in paying their taxes, in contributing to the Constitution, is more meritorious than somebody who's not, and hence deserves more of the goods here being healthcare. What would you say about that?
When you say meritorious, you mean, so now we're talking about merit. So if I pay in, I've earned that right. No.
You could blow it up. Like, I use merit here, which is a strange way of saying that if you pay your taxes, you're a meritorious person, which actually doesn't mean that. I mean, most people who are really highly stationed in the United States don't pay any tax. But I can tell you, those people are not wanting for healthcare.
That's right. Yeah.
So, let me put it this way. Like, do you think the Koch brothers, would have to be would be ever in this situation where their wife needs medicine? So then tell me then, like, what would you have to say about that? That there is, in fact, I'm sure that this is, in fact, something that is happening in this country today, that there is somebody who has a loved one, that loved one needs something life-saving, and they're contemplating whether they should break the law to get it, as opposed to there's somebody out there who has never have to even think about this, and they live in the same country, governed by the same laws. What would you say? Should it be based on merit?
Should it be based on merit? Yeah, I think there should be. I think there should be. When it comes to life and death, I think that there should be a baseline. And I think that there's another way to look at this that's not really ever considered, which is, what about the pharmacist? Pharmacist has access to the drug and can give it to the person in need, knowing that they can't afford it. They themselves then are also breaking the law, but they're doing the morally correct thing, but they are now unjust for doing it, or not necessarily. So coming back to like the definitions of just versus unjust, in unjust because you're taking from someone else, or unjust because you're doing something that.
If the pharmacist hands the medication to somebody for free, like they work at Walgreens or whatever, right? They just take a medication and just hand it to this person, saying, "What? Don't worry about it." They would have broken a law, several laws, as a matter of fact, and they could lose their license, or worse, could be hand bars. I don't know what kind of medication it was. Obviously, they would be fired. And that goes without saying. So, from a legal perspective, that goes to show that one could be virtuous and unlawful if the laws are not virtuous laws.
Right. I mean, and you mentioned this, we shouldn't necessarily say, well, what would Socrates do? But in this scenario, I think we know what Socrates did.
Correct. But we have to take that out of the equation because that is a very high bar to set. And we hear about situations like this where someone decided to break the law to do the right thing. And it goes it goes both ways. Sometimes it's just that the crowds are fickle, right? This is not about what does social media have to say about this person. Most people would support the pharmacist. There'll be a GoFundMe page that will give this person money, and all of those things would happen. But for each of those people who actually does the virtuous thing in the moment, there are several hundreds of thousands of us who will follow the rule of the law, saying that's the right thing to do. I cannot give you a medication like that, man. What if I get sued?
Yeah. I think at the end of the day, it would be there are laws that we should all follow. And on your day-to-day basis, you should be just in follow, like you should be a just person by following those laws. But you mentioned this earlier, like laws should be examined. Laws fit into a larger system. That system needs to be able to work. But the laws need to work for the system, right? That we all live in, that we're all experiencing. And in these scenarios, this is where we're getting to where the laws are unjust.
The laws are unjust in certain situations. Absolutely.
And therefore, are people really unjust or morally wrong for doing what is right? And I'm going to say that I have an opinion on that. And then, laws are meant to be questioned. But I've lived my life that way, where rules are meant to be questioned. And I'm not saying that a stop sign is a suggestion.
Right.
That is there to protect us, ourselves and others. That is for us as a community to have some structure so that we're all safe. That is
Right.
different than laws that are set up that are not actually equitable across. If it's merit based, then it's not equitable, right? That's
Right.
based on, like, if I have status, if I'm the Koch brothers, I can do whatever I want. And I'm never going to be in a situation where that's going to be a problem. But what about the millions of people that it is a problem for? So clearly the laws, and I'm not saying that you go and steal and break the law. I'm saying that you have to actually get back to the systemic issue of the laws are set up in a way where the structure, maybe it's not laws, maybe it's a structure of the society we're living in, isn't a morally just society, and therefore there is no equity, and therefore people are then pushed to make these types of decisions.
Absolutely. Yes. So one is you're following the law, but the other is when you're breaking the law. If one is breaking the law for one's own gain, as opposed to one is breaking the law out of an act of passion, which is worse. So this is a bit nuanced, but the way to look at this is that the way society functions for the most part, we look at acts of passion. If someone is angry and then in that act of passion ends up committing a crime, it's very scary for people because it's almost like, there's an animal instinct that took over. This person lost their rational mind. In that moment, they ended up doing something that makes them a dangerous individual because they could do it again. A lot of that, I don't know how much of that is free will or not. A lot of people like to ascribe blame to the individual for that, but there are lots of reasons why someone flies off the handle. And a lot of those things are not necessarily under one's control. I think most people want to be good people. And there are things that come along the way. Like, just like how we spoke about the non-cardinal virtues of irascibility and good temper, being somebody who's choleric, who just gets really angry very quickly, is not necessarily a choice. There's a quirk that in their personality that makes them that way. Everybody would like to be the likable, funny, happy person. It's just not everybody has that disposition. And we know now some of it is genetic, some of it is social, some of it is, there's so many things that lead to it. So that act of passion is what is on the front page of everything, or of the newspapers, and that's what worries us. Like, what if our neighbor is a psycho? That kind of thing, right? I'll tell you what is more dangerous in my mind is a person who is rational with a very cool mind, thinks about what is good and evil, and chooses evil for their own gain. That Bond villain types. And the world is full of Bond villains who are walking around absolutely scot free in society. And not only that, they are lauded and they are giving lectures and they have buildings named after them just for gain. I'm just giving an example, as opposed to the fact that pharma companies make millions on life-saving medications, which they could definitely reduce the price for and provide it to people, and they make millions in profit doing that. That is, yes, we understand that that's a wrong thing. There's no place to put that. Where do you put that? You say, oh, that's the world. The world turns like that. The individual who commits the act gets shredded by the law, but the law then gets modified in a way that one can do wicked acts for gain. And look, pharma company is just one example. It's an easy target, but from oil companies to name your company, like what was the one that put all the chemicals in the DuPont, or the Enron? I mean, all of these places, like who went to jail?
Well, it gets to a different question that we actually, it might be worth exploring on a different one, but like Enron executives being told or knowing what they're doing, and yet are they the leader, the person in power, or those who are following them that are doing an act because they were told to, versus something that they would choose to do on their own, like knowingly doing it versus saying, well, but I was told to do this,
Right.
And we get into all sorts of examples over time. I think great examples that we read about here in the Kamaki, like the soldier who was told to do something unjust, but he is supposed to be following the laws or the commands of their leader, right? So there's that challenge. There's also the idea that we're, the concept that the example we're using of the husband who steals medicine, like that's potentially a one-time thing, right? So is he that a morally unjust person having done something like this versus, is a one-time event? You bring up the idea of passion. There are laws still, I think, in certain states where murder out of based murders is not the same as murdering someone in cold blood. Or, I mean, if you find your spouse cheating on you in bed and you shoot them both, that's not the same type of crime. You're not someone who, you describe someone who is rational, but thoughtful on what exactly they're doing that's wrong, that's intentionality around it, versus person who walks home, living what they think is a just life, and then they come onto something and they lose it completely. And
Right.
Versus the last example I'll give then, which is the example we were talking about offline, and is Batman.
Yeah.
So the Dark Knight is imposing justice on criminals, yet he is not doing it within the confines of law. And Gotham police are constantly looking for him as well as the Joker and all the others. So is he just? Is he morally, leading a good life? He also happens to have millions and millions. And of course, he donates to orphanages and all sorts of things. Yeah.
Yeah. Is he a good guy or a bad guy? Right. And depends upon which side of the equation you're on. There are cops who think he's a bad guy. And, you as the reader have to kind of decide for yourself. And most of the times, I've not heard anybody say that Batman is the anti-hero. Right. I've never heard that.
No.
But so some of this is fairly intuitive, like you can come upon this, but in one's own life, one finds that if one doesn't reflect on this and look at what one is doing in their life, it's easier to read a comic and in a structured story and then see who the good guy is. And sometimes it's very easy to conflate oneself and say that, what, I'm the good guy. But one has to really measure their actions. And that's why the thought, action, and reflection is extremely important. And hopefully, going through some of these pages, one can actually ask oneself that, am I a morally excellent individual? Am I just following the law, just getting by? We've created such a low bar to what a good human being is. A good human being is someone who pays his taxes and doesn't steal from his neighbor and things like that.
No.
And that is enough. And I think we should hold ourselves to a better standard. If we keep going down this road, then we'll be where we are, in a hyper consumer driven, social media watching, people will saying, oh, I'm a good person, I'm not causing anybody any harm, so how come, why am I a bad person? I get that I think that is important. Like, you cannot be, look, not everybody can be Batman. Like, you're not going kicking people's asses in order for you to be a good person. Like, you're not be a vigilante on the street. But being good to your neighbor is the least thing that you can do. Or actually, take that back. Not doing bad to not harming your neighbor is the least.
That's the least you can do, right?
You can do is not harm your neighbor. Doing good is a higher bar. And then doing good to somebody who's not related to you in any way, is not your neighbor, is an even higher bar.
No, so I think I mean, it's great. And I think that this conversation might have just spun listeners around in circles and then realize, well, what is the answer? And I think there isn't a clear, simple answer to this, but I think it does come back then to the larger question that we started with as kind of a way to reflect on this as you leave. You want to restate that question again?
Yeah. So the question was, is there a difference in being a morally excellent person versus somebody who's just following the law? Is there a difference in those two? And I think our opinion is that yes, there is. In that one should strive to be a morally excellent individual. And I think the first thing is do no harm. I completely agree. Do no harm. Like, don't harm anybody. Don't be an asshole. The next step of the process then is try to be good to to people, at least people in your sphere, in your community, if possible. Then expand that beyond your community and go beyond and participate in a bigger way. But each time when we take a step, one should understand where they are, understand the decisions and choices they are making, and then go back and revisit and see the consequences of that action. And for each of us who's taking those steps, one needs to have some sort of foundation, or some sort of moral underpinning.
In the art of reflection, there is key. I mean, you just kind of laid out multiple steps of reflecting on your actions. It might be that you do something wrong and you spend a lot of time reflecting on that.
Right.
Now, I can say I work with a lot of people who spend a lot of time reflecting on how they are perceived in the world by others without actually thinking about realizing that everyone else is thinking the same. And no one's actually thinking about you. They're thinking about themselves too. And one interaction comes and goes. So you have to look at the bigger picture there too, of all of your actions, not just one.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Well, I think you're right. We have come to the end of this episode.
Yeah. So thank you for listening. And if you like the episode, share it. Give us a rating. And if you did it, send us a message and let us know why, so we can improve.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, everybody. And thanks, Jeremy.
All right. Thanks, Nish.